I know there's a clerkship meeting. I know one person emailed me about that and can't make it. If other people need to attend the clerkship meeting, I think it's going on until about 5:30 or so people need to leave early. But in either case, welcome to our meeting of Advising the Startup, where we're continuing our discussion of FDA regulations. I'm very pleased to have a speaker who's kindly joined us for this class and for other classes for the last several years. Dr. de Sheild, I think, is going to do this through audio. Harven, are you in Canada now, or are you in?
Yes, I'm in Canada.
You're in Canada, yeah. So there's some bandwidth issues and whatnot. But Dr. de Sheild was a former student at the University of Buffalo, where I taught. Did his PhD in biochemistry as well as his law degree. Practiced patent law for a number of years, and now has been working with a startup in the biomedical space. And you're now in phase two of the clinical trials. Is that right?
Yeah, phase two. We completed the phase 2A, so we're actually phase 2B.
Okay.
We have to get clearance from the FDA to do the phase 2B.
Oh, wonderful. Well, so great. We've talked a little bit about that and given the students some background. And I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time and speaking with us for the next hour or so. I'm going to share the screen and do the duties of keeping the slides. I'll share the slides on the Blackboard page after class. I'll post them. But so thank you again, Dr. Sheild. Please, everybody, welcome our guest speaker for today. Thank you again.
Okay, nice to be here. So, Harven de Sheild, I think I don't want to give a long intro because it's only an hour class, but I'm like Dr. Ghosh, Professor Ghosh said, I'm the CEO of a clinical stage biotech company. I used to be a student of Dr. Professor Ghosh back at the University of Buffalo. And that was back, I think, 2004 to 6. And basically, my concentration in law school then was IP and technology law. Then went on to work in law firms, worked for several different companies after that. And presently, like I said, I'm the CEO of this company, Vivacelle Bio. We can go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
So this issue of FDA meetings, in particular the pre-IND meeting or not, if you work in this industry, it comes up all of the time. And the companies are trying to decide whether or not to have it. It's one of those issues where you're not really going to get a consensus on. Some people think it's foolhardy not to have it. Others think that you don't really need it. In our particular case, we skip this. And the reason is if you have a product where if you don't have really specific questions that are going to advance your product, it's not really necessary to have this meeting, at least in my opinion. I mean, in our case, it's a repurposed product. So there's a reference listed drug. And then the 505(b)(2), you're allowed to make modifications to a drug that has already been approved for something else. And so there's a lot of safety and efficacy data on the reference listed drug already. You might be making some changes, as far as you are allowed to make changes. You can't the changes can't be so big that it becomes a new chemical entity. So it's kind of like a fine balancing act that you're doing there. But in that case, unless there's something you're kind of worried about, or you think there could be some potential harm done, risk to the clinical trial subjects, you can more than likely skip the pre-IND meeting. If you go to the next slide, please. So the major risks with if you skip that pre-IND meeting, you could end up with a clinical hold situation, which we'll talk about. It's basically where the FDA tells you that you can't move forward with your clinical trial until you address certain things. Oftentimes, they have to do with safety, but there can be some other issues also, just in terms of, your maybe the manufacturing process and what have you. So stability issues and what have you. So you can, those are the reasons that you could get a clinical hold, which we'll get into. The downside of having the pre-IND meeting is that it's sort of informal, in the sense that whatever advice you get from the FDA, there's really no commitment, legally binding sort of commitment or time frame for them to respond to you. And so it's just sort of like, an informal consultation for the most part. I mean, people like to do it sometimes because you can get early buy-in. You can get your clinical trial design and protocol kind of like, yeah, that looks great and what have you. So some people like it. But the downside is you could get stuck in a back and forth that can go on for an extended period of time that you may not be comfortable engaging in. So oftentimes people just go straight to the IND. Just go ahead and file your IND. Because if you file an IND, the FDA must respond to you within a statutorily set time frame, which is 30 days. Okay, so and then there's more of a commitment, a back and forth that's just, where they're more legally, there's a binding on them to respond and address your responses. So things are just, it seems like it can move a little bit quicker for you. So that's pretty much the main difference. Next slide, please.
Could I ask one just question, maybe clarifying, or are there times when the FDA might require a meeting, or the FDA initiates a meeting?
Yeah, they can.
Okay.
At any time they can, they can do that by telephone. They can, it's a pretty wide latitude, right? They can, it doesn't have, they can just call you up and tell you, they can send you a letter, what have you. So at any time in the process, they can request a meeting.
No, yeah, I think that's right. When I was talking specifically about a pre-IND, what you're describing here is when you should initiate one rather than not initiating one.
Right. They don't typically, as far as I know, they don't typically insist on you having a pre-IND meeting.
Okay. Would there be like?
It's just sort of up to you to decide that. So what I've been describing is like the company deciding whether or not to have one. I've never heard of a situation where the FDA says, you must have a pre-IND meeting. Let's say you file an IND. I've never heard them say, you shouldn't have filed this. Let's go back and do a pre-IND meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and once you file the IND, they'll just address whatever deficiencies they think you have. They'll just go ahead. In 30 days, you'll hear from them and they'll address that. And, so they kind of, that's basically how it works.
Okay.
There are other meetings that they will insist on. For example, once you complete your phase 2 or phase 3, you must have a meeting, like kind of in order to go from in our case, for example, we completed a phase 2A, and then which was 20 subjects. In order to do our phase 2B, we must have an end of phase 2A meeting. We don't. That's mandatory. Yeah. So, okay, we can go to the next slide, please. I think I've kind of been over this already. The advantages of the pre-IND meeting is that, you can get specific questions answered, sort of get early buy-in, minimize issues that can come up with your chemistry and manufacturing. But I've already addressed the potential disadvantages of doing that. Next slide, please. So what happens if you end up with a clinical hold? First of all, the clinical hold can happen at any time during the process of getting your drug approved. So it can happen after you file your IND. They can tell you can't move on. So the IND is typically the first investigation new drug application. People just call it IND, even though there's an A there technically. But so you file that, and then the process gets started. They can hit you with a clinical hold right at that time. And basically, it's telling you that you cannot continue unless you address certain issues. And they'll lay out and spell out all of the things that you need to address. And if they can do it by telephone, writing, or any form of communication, and then within 30 days, they have to give you a written explanation explaining the basis of the clinical hold. It can be a partial clinical hold or it can be a full clinical hold. So that's basically, and you'll see on other slides what typically leads to this clinical hold. Next slide, please.
One again clarifying question. I know you have a lot of slides to go through, so I want to just so have. The manufacture of the drug or plans or proposed manufacture of the drugs could occur anywhere in the world, right? And the FDA would then need all the information to approve that. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And similarly for where the clinical trials are going to be as well, right?
Yeah, it's similar, right? Exactly.
So does the FDA then coordinate with the other agencies or their equivalents, let's say in Europe or in Canada or in Mexico or?
No, not really. What they're doing, unless you file, if you file something with those other agencies, you would have to give all those regulatory correspondence, right? Will be part of your IND if you have filed something, like if you started the process there or something like that. But if you didn't start a process with another, say the what do you call them, the
European
EMA
medicine. Yeah.
Right. If you didn't file a drug application with them that pertains to your current application in front of the FDA, the FDA doesn't really interact with them at all. You're just basically using a foreign site to conduct your clinical trial, which happens all the time.
Yeah.
Or if you're manufacturing your drug overseas, the most important thing is typically, there are standards that you have to abide by, GMP compliant or GMP certifications, that kind of stuff. And the same thing sort of applies with clinical trials. So as long as those places are cleared, let's say by the FDA, you should be fine.
So we're going on to the next. So thank you. So we're going on to the next slide. Okay.
Absolutely. So like I said, they can be issued. The clinical holds can happen at any time. Phase 2, phase 3, phase 1. It can happen immediately after you file your IND. So it's just the bottom line is you cannot continue unless the clinical hold is lifted, and then you're allowed to continue your clinical trials. So the issue comes up also if you're, let's say, especially if you're publicly traded, a publicly traded company, you do have to disclose these things because it can impact whether or not people invest in your company and what have you. So some people do that. You can do it on your website, or some people do it through the Form 10 disclosure to the SEC. And then, they can also you can find out if you go to the clinicaltrial.org, you can see the companies that have a clinical hold as well. So there are ways to find out about it.
Okay.
Next slide, please.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are just examples of clinical, the language, of clinical holds, right? So in this first case, the company was required to complete additional preclinical studies in order to proceed with the dosing regimen. In the second case, they got a clinical hold because the FDA needed additional chemistry, manufacturing, and controls information. So they needed additional information with respect to the manufacturing process. So there's two different examples of reasons that can lead to a clinical hold order, as it's called. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So this is a case where, you can go, like I said, you can go to the clinicaltrials.org and you can look up a study and see if there has been a clinical hold issue on this study. In this case, there was a clinical study on this particular drug, and you can, so it kind of gives you an idea. Let's say you're interested in that company or that product or what have you, and they say they're doing a clinical trial. You can go to clinicaltrials.org and you can search and see if there is a clinical hold order with respect to that specific product or a clinical trial. Yeah. So this is an instance where, again, this is just different examples. I think it's from the example before. The clinical hold had to do with safety. That's the primary reason that they typically will issue these clinical holds. And, it may be imposed when there's a concern for patient safety, and maybe, you submitted new data, findings or developments in new clinical processes or whatever that you've described. And so then they scrutinize that and they think, there's some sort of deficiency in those things that, but for the most part, it often ties back to safety, right? Because even if they're talking about your manufacturing process, that has to do, let's say if the product's not going to be stable, or they think that the way you've described your manufacturing process is going to lead to an unstable product, then ultimately, for the most part, it comes back to safety. Next slide, please. So these are just common reasons for the issuance of clinical trials, some of which I've described. The quality and control issues that has to do with the product, toxicity concerns, which is safety, same thing, manufacturing and sterility process, all has to do with the safety of the product, or if there's degradation products that they worry about in your manufacturing process and what have you, or certain metabolites that they think is going to accumulate that could do harm to a patient, so they can issue a clinical hold until you address those issues. Other reasons are, again, human harm, like we said, and sometimes they'll issue a hold if they think the investigators, for some reason, lack the required training or experience. Again, that has to do with safety of the subjects. So, so that can come up. Or you have to submit what's called your IB, your investigator's brochure, and they'll scrutinize that to make sure that there's no misleading or incomplete information in that. If your study has like a gender bias, even though the disease threatens both genders, so that can lead to also clinical trial or clinical hold order until you address the gender bias. Yeah. Next slide, please.
One other question.
Yeah.
Is it just one commissioner on the FDA that can issue a clinical hold, or is it a majority? Or how does that process work in terms of determining whether there would be, is that not open?
Yeah, I don't think it's the commissioner, actually. I think it's just the officers that you're dealing with of the particular unit. Yeah. So when you file your IND, it goes to a particular section depending on what the product is, whether it's a biologic or a drug, a chemical drug, and so just depending on which, or is it a veterinarian product, so wherever each of those divisions, the officers that are going to be reviewing your documents can issue that order.
Okay, so it's a bit like an office action and
exactly
with the USPTO.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Let me go down to the next slide. Sorry about this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, these are some of the solutions or steps you can take to minimize the possibility, or at least mitigate them after you've received them. You may have to conduct additional studies. You may have to modify your manufacturing process. You may have to, select the right animal models to more properly validate your toxicity issues and stuff, because it really matters, like, that depending on the particular indication that you're trying to treat, the model that you're using really matters. So the animal model that you're using. You may have to better document and validate your manufacturing process. So your GMP, non-GMP, the GMP is just good manufacturing process. And usually you have what they call engineering batches and clinical trial batches. So you may have to just show better documentation for those sort of things. There's always informed consents, and you have to make sure that there are reasonable
So sorry about that.
That's okay. Reasonable expectations that are part of that informed consent. And just, oftentimes you need to have the right experts working on your drug. I don't want to cut corners. There's things you should address upfront, like the drug product stability, pay attention to things like what they call the IC50 of a drug, which is extremely important and comes up all the time. It's just basically the concentration at which, the minimum concentration at which the drug has its efficacy. So there's some, if you want the IC50 to be as low as possible. The higher it is, the potential for side effects and toxicity goes up. So you might have to reformulate or maybe use a combination drug or something, but paying attention to things like that early on helps you minimize the possibility of getting a clinical hold on the issue.
Yep. And as far as the informed consent, did you want to elaborate a little bit about that? I'm sure the students may have talked about it in tort law when they talked about medical malpractice or other areas, but
so informed consent it's basically a form that you have to prepare, and before you can enroll any clinical trial subject, you have to go over all of the safety issues that could come up in the trial. And it's meant to sort of address, mitigate issues of you enrolling people under misleading sort of circumstances where or they're not completely informed about your study, because maybe sometimes you may be desperate to get subjects enrolled if you're doing a study where it's hard to recruit patients. So that's why those forms is kind of meant to address those kind of things, and you're legally obligated to make sure that you address all of those things. If the person, the potential subject, if there's a language barrier, you have to make sure that that form is translated in whatever their native language is, and stuff. So there's like particular information that you have to abide by, and a very strict set of procedures that you have to follow to obtain their consent from every subject that you enroll in your clinical trial. And that form has to be approved by an IRB, so an investigational review board. Typically, you will have an investigational review board of a clinical trial. They have to approve that form as well to make sure that it's appropriate.
Okay. And there's the FDA also has some guidelines, is that correct?
Right. Yes, as well as the FDA, right?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And some studies, you also have a data and safety monitoring board, so they also can have input into that as well. It's kind of like a board that it's just an additional layer of protection that you will have. You have the IRB, you have a data and safety monitoring board that, let's say if your study is 20 patients, after you do the first 5, the first 10, you have to constantly meet with them, and they have to review the data to make sure that the trial is being conducted in a safe manner. So as a last course of resort, in all of these administrative procedures, you have to exhaust, after you've exhausted all your other remedies, if you can't try to get rid of your clinical hold, if it's still not working out, you can always refer the dispute to this ombudsman process that's at the FDA. So they're basically there, and they, meant to be like the final sort of internal body that you can go to address these conflicts if you're having with the FDA. You can also eventually you can bring a lawsuit as well, right? People sue the FDA quite often, so as well. But you have to, as you guys know, you have to exhaust remedies in these administrative bodies before you can start suing outside, for the most part.
And most of these do get resolved, right? Are there some big cases out there where the FDA has been sued on these issues? I mean, successfully or unsuccessfully?
Yeah, I think most of these clinical holds, they get resolved. I don't know personally of any case with respect to clinical hold that ended up in litigation.
Yeah.
Most times it's a very collaborative process. They want people to do these trials and stuff, especially if it's at an IND stage. They want people to conduct these trials. They want to bring new drugs to the public and what have you. So it's going to be very collaborative. And, unless if the company is simply, I would say, just negligent and not unresponsive and to FDA's requests and stuff like that, then the clinical hold could just be permanent. Sometimes the companies just cannot, they simply can't address the deficiencies. So they themselves will basically abandon the IND because of the clinical hold. But I don't know of any specific case where it actually went to litigation.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on like this to the
Yes.
next one. Yeah.
Okay. So as we've been, because of the pandemic and what have you, I thought this would be appropriate to address this issue of federal expanded access to treatment. You can also have these right to try state-based uses as well. So for the most part, there are three main federal versions of this expanded access. The one that is most people maybe have heard of because of COVID-19 is what's called for short EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. That's just the first federal expanded access sort of regulations, the first category. And in that category, you can get that immediately approved. It's much faster. You don't have to wait for 30 days before you start to use the drug. So it's meant to be very accelerated. There is a 15-day window that you then have to submit. So let's say they approve it by phone or letter or what have you, and they tell you, yes, go ahead, use your drug. It could be a drug that was used for something else to treat another disease, but somebody thinks it can be used to treat COVID-19 because it was used to treat inflammation, let's say, in some other rheumatoid arthritis or something. So they say, oh, sure, go ahead. People are dying, and inflammation is a big part of what kills people in COVID-19. So yeah, sure. They give you this EUA and you're off and running. After 15 days, you have to provide a written submission to the FDA after that initial allowance. You have to also file a new IND. So you eventually, it will come with an investigation of new drug. But unlike the typical IND process, clearly you're now giving it to people whereby a typical drug, sometimes it can take as many as 10 years if it's a new chemical entity, right? So you're looking at 10 years before the drug is cleared by the FDA. If you're having a more, let's say, a repurposed drug, sort of like with my company, 505(b)(2) process, where you're using an old drug and you've made modifications to it and what have you, it's a much shorter process. Let's call it 5 years or so versus 10 years. In this case, EUA, your people are dying and they are, allowing you to go ahead and use the drug to treat people. The other two versions of that, the second one has to do with, I would say, more like when you have clinical trials, they have these cohorts. So they're basically like different kind of groups. And you just maybe want to expand the study for a particular patient population or so. So sometimes they will make you get this, require this expanded access approval. That one you have to, there's no 30-day wait period, but you do have to provide a protocol to the IRB. Your protocol must be approved by the IRB and FDA in order to be given the expanded access for immediate sized patient populations. And for the third one there, that's basically it's, as you can see, you're gonna use the drug for widespread treatment. There is a 30-day wait period before you can use it, unlike the EUA. They do insist on you waiting for 30 days, and the drug must be under active consideration to be marketed. In the for the last part, the expanded access for widespread treatment, it has to be a drug that's like almost about to be marketed. So basically at the end of the FDA approval process, and because they know that it's going to be used for widespread treatment. So there's a little bit more stringency there. They're trying to, and then they also, not only do they require a drug that's almost about to be marketed, they also want you to wait for 30 days, unlike the EUA where they just tell you go ahead. And in that case, it can be an investigation, a new drug. It can be a drug that's already approved also, but even if it's a new drug for the EUA, they can allow you to go ahead right away. Next slide, please.
So in the COVID situation, was much of the impetus done because of its effect on elderly populations? Obviously there was a pandemic, but was there which one of these, was it a combination of the three that expedited?
I would say it was mainly number one. Most of them were just straight emergency use authorizations, where they just, it's the fastest categories of drugs. I mean, in some cases, I think that there were some of these other ones, maybe like, like it probably was like more of a combination of them, but most of the ones that were actually publicized, it was done on an EUA.
That's it.
Emergency use authorization. But it sounds like they were taking, things into consideration, like widespread use. And then as they got criticized, the FDA was getting a lot of pushback for approving these drugs maybe too quickly. I think they started imposing like, longer time frames on the emergency use authorizations. In some cases, I know of one case where they actually took it back, right? So they can actually retract it, the EUA, after they give it to you. So they started becoming more stringent about that. One main point here is that for all of these, you have to file a new drug application. Mm-hmm. Unlike the compassionate use case, which I'm going to talk about, the compassionate use is basically meant to address, you have to just have an IND that's existing. So there must be an IND for a particular drug already in existence, and some doctor wants to use that drug, and it has to be in the context, obviously a clinical trial is occurring, and they find out that, this clinical trial seems to be going well, and they have a patient that needs that drug. So that's basically what the compassionate use is about. And they don't have to file an IND in order to use the drug on a compassionate use basis. The company has to get the approval from the FDA to give them authorization to use the drug on a compassionate use basis. So they can then supply it to people, but they're not allowed to charge people for it, right? So if your company gets compassionate use, you cannot use that to make money off of that. You can use it just to help people. You're not allowed to charge even for things like shipping, nothing. So you're just giving it to the public because maybe your drug is beneficial somehow, and so you're providing it to the public because the public needs it for some another indication that their doctors want to address. So that's kind of how the compassionate use works. There is no new IND required.
Hmm. So let me
Yep.
move on to the next slide then.
Yeah. So I've talked about this already. You can go to the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this one?
So these are just some of the things that they've issued EUAs for, some of the indications of diseases: COVID-19, anthrax, Ebola, some types of influenza, and MERS, the last one there. So they tend not to want to just issue them willy-nilly, so they're trying to kind of restrict the use of them. The main requirement is, the minimum requirement is that there be a known and potential benefits. The known and potential benefits must outweigh the known potential risks. So that's it's like a balancing act that they're doing there before they issue it. The drug I was talking about was hydroxychloroquine, where they had to retract the EUA that was given for it. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about compassionate use already. So that you typically, when these factors are applied, that's when you give the compassionate use. There must be a serious, a life-threatening disease in which there is no other alternative to treat that, or the doctor feels that the alternatives are not really going to address the disease or condition. The patient cannot enroll in a clinical trial. So you can't just say, okay, why don't we just enroll my patient in your clinical trial, that way they get treated. So when there's not a possibility of that, and again, the potential benefit justifies the potential risk of treatment. So these are the typical conditions under which compassionate use will be issued by the FDA. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So typically, as you know, so states always try to sort of mirror these, whenever you have these sort of, the FDA has these federal access programs, so the states started coming up with their own right to try laws. It kind of reads more like compassionate use. I mean, it's like a hybrid, I think, of the compassionate use as well as the federal expanded program. And it varies from state to state. As of I think there's more than 41 now, 42 that have these right to try laws that allow terminally ill patients to bypass the FDA federal expanded access program and obtain these experimental therapy. So it's just basically the states trying to be responsive to people that are terminally ill, and not having there's a potential product out there to treat the person, or at least reduce their suffering or prolong their life, improve the quality of their life, and they shouldn't have to wait until a clinical trial is completed or what have you in order to access the drug. So no demonstrated efficacy data is required. Only safety data and testing is required. So only phase 1. That's all that's needed under the state right to try laws. They're not regulated by the FDA. Few, if any, safety procedures in place to protect patients and monitor for adverse reactions to the experimental treatment. So those are some of the, I guess, criticisms that have come up with respect to there's not as many oversights. They have gotten a lot better. I mean, since 2014, right? There are more stringent sort of safety monitoring, compliance stuff in place. Back then, I mean, the FDA authorizes probably like 99. Most of these expanded requests get approved by the FDA. As of 2016, there hadn't been any successful right to try cases. I don't know whether, I think by now, I think the situation is much better, because it was only because it had only been like 2 years old back then, so it was new, and people were a little bit skeptical about allowing the states to do this other stuff, but it has gotten much better now. Next slide. So there, as a result of the State Right to Try Act, in 2018, this federal law was put into place under President Trump. 2018, that was signed. So it basically is used when you have tried all approved treatment options, and people who are unable to participate in clinical trials out there, but still need access to certain investigation or treatment options. So those are the circumstances. Similar to the state right to try, this is just a federal right to try, sort of meaning to be more responsive. They're basically trying to avoid or minimize the bureaucracy of the FDA, if you want to say that. That's kind of what it's trying to streamline the process and get the drugs to people that are dying or have life-threatening disease. Next slide, please. So what happens now when let's say you've gone through your clinical trials and your drug has been cleared by the FDA, which is the rightful term. The FDA itself actually use approve, but then their own sites say that they don't really approve a drug. They clear drugs, right? So after FDA clearance of your drug, there are restrictions on how the company can market a drug. So you have to, the bottom line is the company has to market the drug in strict compliance with what's on that FDA cleared label. So when your drug gets approved, there's a label that goes with it, and you have to stick to that label. The label has, things like, what is the drug approved for? What is it meant to treat? So if your drug is approved to treat heart disease, the company cannot market it to treat glaucoma, even if they have data that shows that. You have to stick with what's on your label as far as your marketing materials and what have you. If you want to get an expansion of your label, you can do that. You can go back to FDA and maybe the studies that you did to get the first indication approved, maybe there's data in there that you can rely on without having to do additional studies and expand your label that way. It's possible to do that if the data is already there. Typically, the FDA will ask you to do additional studies to expand that label. And then, if you get your expanded label, now, you can use it to treat heart disease and you can use it to treat glaucoma, what have you. Now you can market it to do those things. Can you go to the next slide?
Sure. And so for some of these labels, do you want to talk a little bit about the limitations on doctors and things like off-label uses?
So unlike the companies, the FDA is not allowed to kind of basically they can't restrict how doctors practice medicine. So unlike a company, the doctors can use the drug if they have good evidence, that they can rely on evidence in the literature and what have you, and they can use the drug they could use that drug, let's say, was approved only to treat heart disease, but based on publications and journal articles and what have you, they think that there's evidence that it can be used to treat my glaucoma patient. They can go ahead and do that. Unlike the company cannot. They can only market and promote their drug in accordance with what's captured on the FDA label. Now, if you have more information in your marketing material that looks like, it can be used for an additional use, the FDA is not going to just go off of that. They might say to you, we see here, this is part, in your marketing material, they'll, more than likely tell you to go ahead and try to expand your label as opposed to putting it out there. It doesn't mean that, you know, your materials just have to be consistent with your FDA required label. So you can't have false or misleading things in there. But if you have some information, even if it's not directly captured by your label, as long as it's consistent with your approved FDA, your FDA cleared label, then you're in it. Then you should be fine. Just basically whatever you say has to be consistent with what's in the FDA required label for that drug.
And then as far as pharmacies are concerned, the FDA does have some moderate or some small regulations for pharmacies. Is that correct? Or
yes, I believe so.
Yeah. The pharmacies can follow what the doctors, as long as there's a valid doctor's prescription, the pharmacy can fill it unless there's some suspicion that there's some wrongdoing or.
Right, absolutely. And the pharmacies, you know, they also have these duties, you know, they have their own sort of independent duty to make sure that before they dispense any drug, regardless of what the doctor has prescribed, they have to make sure that the drug is also safe based on their own information. For, you know, they have to check to make sure based on, let's say if the patient, like things like drug interaction, for example, that's left to the pharmacy. So the doctor might prescribe this drug to treat some, you know, let's say glaucoma, and they say, oh, this drug hasn't been approved for that, but the doctor has prescribed that. They can go along with that, but they also need to make sure that there are no drug interactions, you know, and things. So they still have to do their own, go through their own procedures that they have, that they are legally mandated to do before dispensing, you know, medication. Independent of that prescription, they have their own sort of requirements as well.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the things I've always wanted to integrate into this class is some of the developments in medicinal marijuana and other use of marijuana. I mean, New York has not, as far as I know, I think they've made some movement in terms of medicinal marijuana, but they haven't gone the way of California or New Mexico or Washington State and so forth. So that's just another layer, right? When you have controlled substances like marijuana or even psychotropic drugs, right? And
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's a whole set of additional regulations that govern how those things are dispensed.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the problem with those things also, because there's so much, it's the whole federal state sort of you push and pull, right? I mean, the feds, some things are still illegal. And then on the state side, it's legally permitted. So there's always that as well.
Yeah, right.
That an independent pharmacy has to, I mean, this has been in the news, I think just yesterday or so. It was like, so with California, right? And this medication that's meant to treat abortion or give, I guess you can say, I suppose they said it's not just for ending abortions, there's other uses of it as well. So that drug was approved by the FDA, but individual states are restricting its disposition. So
yes.
You have like things like that. And I think Walgreens has been basically California saying that they're gonna, you know, not award them their state contracts and that sort of stuff because California wants them to follow the FDA has approved the drug, so they believe that their state citizens should have access to the drug. And the companies and Walgreens is saying, well, their shareholders, I think there's some issues about that and what have you. And because I think there's 41 states that have threatened to sue them if they dispense that medication. So that's going to lead to, you know, there's shareholder issues. So how does a company balance all this stuff? At the same time, I don't think they want to lose all of the California business as well. So it's kind of like a tight spot for them to be in, but that's the kind of stuff that can happen.
Yeah, no, the whole issue of pregnancy-related drugs is another issue that, you know, is ripe for practice, and it's coming up, and I know, you know, sort of practice areas have been developing in that. as far as medicinal marijuana and other uses of marijuana, we've had at least one or two former students who are actually working for startups in that space. I think one in Oregon and I think one in California as well. So that's another interesting area. And as soon as New York, if New York liberalizes to the extent that other states have, it'll be interesting to see what happens here. So, and I'll probably teach it. I don't want to get into trouble teaching things when it's illegal in the States. So, but you should be aware of the issues. Are you up to the next slide or?
Yes, please. Yeah. So basically, if there's a yes to any of these questions, then the company has to make sure that it's addressed. So are there suggestions about the product that relate to a different indication, right? Glaucoma versus heart disease. Is the patient population different than what's reflected in the FDA required label? What about instructions for handling the use of the product and stuff? Does it conflict with what is said in the FDA required label? The dosage, if you're using a completely different dosage than what was approved, that can be an issue, obviously, because it can affect the safety. Not only the dosage, but also the regimen, how it's dispensed, the route of administration, right? If the drug was approved to be inhaled and you decide that, it can be injected and you promote that, well, that's different. That's a different route of administration for which it was not approved. Your label doesn't say that. It says that it has to be inhaled. So if you answer yes to any of these, then you could be sanctioned by the FDA or what have you. So those are kind of things that you have to really pay attention to. Once your drug gets cleared by the FDA to be marketed, you have these obligations to stick to what's on that label. And then you always have to collect the safety data and safety information also as the drug is being used. So post-marketing obligations as well to make sure the drug is safe.
Great. So
yeah,
next slide.
So the last sort of stuff, I think, let me see. We've talked about non-label, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about this before I get into the last topic. This is sort of off-label use, which we've talked about already. That the physicians they can do this because again, the FDA can't restrict their practice of medicine. And so they can, unlike companies, they can use, have these off-label uses and use the drug for that purpose. But it has to be based on available evidence, so the off-label prescription although it's not illegal or unethical, but it must be based on available evidence. Sometimes they can run into some issues with reimbursement, right? Mm-hmm. And insurance. So while these doctors have the right to, they can't restrict their practice of medicine, but if you work for a hospital system, your particular hospital may have their own views on this stuff because they want to be reimbursed. And sometimes the insurer may not want to reimburse for these sort of off-label uses. Sometimes if they think that it's going to lead, if they have a different viewpoint and they think that it's not safe for the doctor to be prescribing that drug for off-label use, there can be pushback from that end. So it's kind of one of those things that the practitioners have to consider also.
I think one area where that's coming up, it comes up in some of the opioid areas, but in another more area that hasn't really maybe gotten as much attention, like Ozempic is a drug to deal with diabetes, but it's also a weight loss. And so there's always this, patients want to get Ozempic because they may not necessarily be diabetic or borderline, but they want the weight loss. It's an easy weight loss. I've heard stories of people losing 40, 50 pounds using Ozempic. So there is always this question, when will a physician do that? How close do you have to be diabetic? to allow the doctor to prescribe it. In fact, there is, I think now a shortage of Ozempic.
Right, because of that. So that's
yeah.
the other reason why people push back on that, because there's always, and especially most recently, seems like there's shortages of many drugs.
Yeah.
So some people think that, well, that's kind of cosmetic, but at the same time, the weight loss is not necessarily the case, because it is a medical condition,
Right.
that, and the weight loss, the weight can lead to diabetes and other things. So and you can't restrict the practitioners' practice if they think that their particular patient can benefit from that, like it's going to help their overall health. It's sort of like it gets to the point where there's like an interference with the practice of medicine, and because the physician is supposed to be able to say, well, I think this particular patient would really benefit if I, it's not the same as cosmetic surgery, let's say.
Right. Botox or whatnot. Yeah.
It's so, but people are trying to put it in that category, but it's quite different because it literally can affect like chronic illnesses and what have you. So.
Yeah. So let's go on to this. Hopefully, people are getting a sense of the practice areas that all this law is affecting. I mean, even if you're not going to be, working with an FDA startup or medical device startup or drug startup, if you're doing tort law or products liability law, some of these things can come up and are worth. And as we'll see a little bit in tomorrow's class when we talk about preemption and the relationship between products liability and FDA, some interesting interactions. So thank you.
Okay. So we can go to the next slide. Those are just some examples of off-label use that most people heard about.
Yeah, you can take a look at those. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So this last topic is just, I thought it was interesting to bring in here because this is a case of where Freedom of Information Act is sort of, so it's like you file this freedom to access this information at the FDA, but at the same time, there's like it conflicts sometimes because it could give you a competitive advantage as a company. In this particular case, it was the NIH. They were developing this drug, and I believe it's an HIV drug, and they wanted to just benefit from work that had already been done. The context in this particular context is that I think there had been 20 years. So basically the patents and stuff would have expired anyways. And they tried getting the information that they needed from the company. So it was basically kind of like a specific information with respect to something, how the drug was being manufactured and what have you, basically trying not to reinvent the wheel, right? And if the drug has been around 20 years, the synthetic processes were kind of at that point sort of obsolete. So there's really no competitive advantage that this company was really going to obtain. So that's why there was, that NIH here actually was going to, obtain. So I think that's why it was they were successful. They do have this dominant disclosure motif, which basically means if obtaining the information is likely to contribute to public understanding of the operations or activities of the government, and it's not primarily in the commercial interest of the requester, in this case, the NIH, because they don't want people to abuse this process, or companies to abuse this process, just to get a competitive advantage, with respect to the competitors. If there's a potential public health benefit, the FDA, they kind of like may lean towards disclosing this information, but the FDA correspondence, a lot of this stuff is meant to be proprietary, privileged. If you ever do patent litigation, you find out the companies fight tooth and nails over anything that they submit to the FDA. They would prefer to keep it all secret, privileged. They don't want it to be disclosed, and they don't want their competitors to get even, let's say, their protocol trial design. If they can, they want to keep that secret. In this case, like your manufacturing process, especially if it's a new way to do something, you can imagine you want to try to keep it secret as well. So that's kind of, basically it's kind of like a case whereby the Freedom of Information Act was used to gain information that led to accelerating and advancing this new drug that was going to do a lot of good for the public. And I think the fact that it was the NIH may have helped here also. That was requesting and not necessarily like a competitor company. So, and the company basically said also, not only has 20 years gone by, we don't keep all this meticulous record keeping after a certain amount of time, and they just didn't feel comfortable responding to the NIH. So the NIH basically had no choice but to go to the NIH, to the FDA to try to get this information. You can go to the next slide. I think I should be wrapping up.
Yep. But
yeah. So they basically thought that the safety profile would support repurposing. So they were taking an HIV drug and repurposing it, I believe, to treat leukemia and possibly accelerate clinical development. So that was the context for asking for the information that they needed, pharmacology type information that they needed from the company. The company said, given the sensitivity of the commercial records and the age of the records, they didn't want to cooperate. I think it was Harven de Sheild back then. So that was kind of like their position. So they basically had no choice but to, and they didn't want to reinvent the wheel. It would have cost a whole lot more to do that, to bring this drug to the public. So they successfully used this. I think they got like over 400 pages worth of information in the end. And so it was a good use of the FOIA.
Yep.
Go to the next slide. I think that's, yeah. I think that's pretty much it. I mean, there were things, often all of these requests would come with like redactions and stuff. So if this was no different. They sort of redacted chemistry data and stuff, since they didn't need to know all of that. They just needed to know about, mainly the safety profile, pharmacology stuff. And like I said, I think the case, because the methodology had advanced anyway, the synthetic organic chemistry methodologies, and the fact that the patent had lapsed by this time, was expired, I think all of that contributed. There is a fight with these stuff. The company can also try to, they can sue over this to not have their information released to a third party. And so that's basically the state of this.
Okay, go on.
You can go to, let me see if there's anything else. I think that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is mostly about the confidentiality of the information and the privileged
Right,
nature. Yeah.
And then, I mean, the technical message here, I can go and say, it's basically a delicate balance. The FDA is quite a court in the middle. They want to do things that will enhance public safety. They want to, if they want to promote new uses of an old drug, because if you have a drug that's already been approved and somebody's trying to repurpose it, the person shouldn't have to start from scratch, especially if there's been like 20 years to gain access to basic safety pharmacology information that's going to help them make the new use of that drug even safer for the public. So, when it's those kinds of things, that's like they take into context patent rights, confidentiality, proprietary sort of interest. It cannot be just to enhance the commercial interest of the person that's asking.
Yeah.
So like I said, I think it's the fact that it was the NIH and not another company probably made it a lot more easier for the FDA to release all of this information. But that is something that if you're working at a company and you're trying to develop a new drug, if you can use this process to gain access to information that may help speed up, improve the safety, let's say, of the drug. And if the FDA is willing to give it to you, then it's worth trying to get it.
And I think when there is a FOIA disclosure, it's not limited to the person just asking for it. I mean, it can be shared. It is a public disclosure of sorts, right?
Right.
It can be redacted. So that's why this is fairly important. And this is also relevant because after spring break, we'll talk about generic drugs in some detail and talk a bit about something called ANDA, abbreviated new drug application, where the generic drug manufacturer can make use of some of the information in the original NDA from the branded drug manufacturer. Have you worked with ANDAs, Harven? Or
I did a lot. I did ANDA litigation actually.
Yeah.
So that's called the Hatch-Waxman litigation. So,
yeah.
So basically, the whole idea is that the government wants to encourage. They're trying to. The reason that law was passed, the Hatch-Waxman law, was to have cheaper versions of these branded drugs available to the public. So the the generic drug is identical to the, in terms of active pharmaceutical ingredient, what have you. The branded drugs just cost a whole lot more. So that's basically kind of the push and pull they want. But in order to be successful, if there's still a patent that governs that brand drug, then you have to, if you want to launch your generic drug, you have to bring litigation. Well, you can file your ANDA, but then the brand drug will bring litigation, right?
Yes.
To stop you from
paragraph 4,
paragraph 4, or there's paragraph 3, and so it's different. Where some you can, then you have to make certifications. The generic drug company then has to put in place these certifications, basically responding to the lawsuit from the brand drug.
Yeah.
Saying, for example, your patent has expired. If that's the easiest one. If your patent has expired, then you can't stop us from. We should be allowed to proceed. The main case that comes up is to say that you should have not been granted these patents.
Right.
And they try to basically invalidate the patents from the brand drug. That's essentially paragraph 4 litigation, right?
Right. That's where it gets most.
And so it gets really interesting. Most of the cases end up being settled.
Right.
After about 2-3 years of the lawyers billing back and forth, then they right before trial they tend to settle. I would say probably as high as at least 70% of those cases. I would say right before the trial or at the trial, and then the other ones,
Yeah, and we're going to talk about reverse settlements after spring break, and in the context of Hatch-Waxman and the Actavis case. So this will come up again, and it's relevant, to the FOIA and what you're discussing here because of the generic drugs. I mean, there is a certain data exclusivity that the branded drug manufacturer has too, that the generic drug manufacturer has to work around. So there's a lot of pieces here.
So there's like market exclusivities. Right.
Yeah.
That can interfere. Like if there's a new chemical entity, I think it's something like 10 years, 7 years, or so. So those market exclusivity, if they extend beyond the patent term, then that's like giving the company additional protection of years. So,
right, yeah.
So they can get a market exclusivity right at the end of the patent term and get extends. If they get it too early, it runs parallel with the patent term, so it may not help them. So it depends when they got it and how far out from the expiration of the patent that they have it. So ideally the company wants to have both market exclusivity and patent exclusivity. So
so there's so much to talk about. So thank you for giving us your perspective and what you're working on. So thanks again for that. And
you're welcome.
And before we adjourn, I guess first of all, are there any questions that the people in the class have, or?
I'm sorry about my video. It says that it's on. I don't know why.
I don't either. Maybe I can take a look. But no, sorry.
No problem.
But are there any questions? I'm trying to see, I don't see if there's anything in the chat or people wanna. So I had two questions just to wrap up. One is you talked a lot about the FDA as far as your product is progressing. Have you already taken care of the patent side, or did you not pursue patents in this particular product?
No, we did. Yeah, we did.
Yep.
We have patent protection. Yeah, we have that in place as well.
So that was several years ago, or relatively, went pretty quickly. So, and now this is the side. So are you applying then for patent term extension as well, or?
Well, eventually we will get into that. Yeah, eventually, yes, that will come up as well.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. And so I hope you get your FDA approval soon, but there's a part of me that hopes you don't get it, so you can come and tell us more every year about this story, because it's always very interesting, and I think it gives people in the class some perspective on this. So the one last question I have is for people who want to get into this practice area, space. We've talked about different dimensions to this, right? There's obviously the FDA side, there's the patent side, there's the litigation side, there's the products liability side, there's representing doctors. Any advice about how you would enter into this space, or certainly if you're working in the business startup space, you need to know and be aware of these issues, because medical and medical device startups are quite common. So go ahead.
I think my advice I always say is it's good. Like, let's say typically you finish law school and you get into a firm. It's always good if you can. I mean, some firms are more encouraging of this, others are not so encouraging of this, but if you can try out different practice areas. For example, let's say if you work at a firm that does paragraph 4 litigation, basically what we were talking about just now is the pharma litigation. You may have went in to do that, but if you get there, they typically will have a FDA regulatory practice as also. They may have that. Right, which is basically it's separate. So that's separate from the people that are doing the pharma litigation. This is more transactional. I mean, there's litigation involved also, because if a company takes the FDA to court, so those same lawyers will participate in that litigation. But oftentimes it's more sort of transactional, fighting with FDA, sort of through that process. The FDA correspondence back and forth with the FDA, so there's a practice just for that. So basically, FDA regulatory practice, which can include litigation as well. So, those are things. Let's say you get there, you came in and you thought you are interested in pharma litigation, but it may not hurt to also work with in another practice at a law firm. Especially if the practices are complementary. I think that's a really good if we go back in the day, like the typical patent practitioners, they actually practice across all areas. So they didn't used to just do prosecution or litigation. They would do it all.
Right.
That's not so common anymore.
So,
if you, depending on the firm you're at, rather than, because oftentimes people don't really know, because they haven't done it, they don't really know exactly which practice they really like, Just because you have I know many people, just because you have, let's say you have a science, technical background, but you may find that you don't want to be a patent prosecutioner, you may want to do litigation. So there are people with, for example, with PhDs that are doing patent litigation, and have never done prosecution. So that's just an example of, I would say, not allowing people to just sort of pigeonhole you and say, you have this background, this is what you must do. Because the fact is, you just graduated from law school, so you can choose your own path, as opposed to having the firm tell you or dictate which practice you must do. So that's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, no, we'll have one of the guest speakers we'll have right after spring break. I was just talking to him this afternoon, has been sort of a path like that. And so we'll have some chance to talk about that after spring break. So once again, thank you. And just for the rest of the class, thanks for your attention. We're going to meet tomorrow again via Zoom. And just to remind you, we're going to finish up these slides on FDA regulations that we talked about last week. And we're going to pick up with slide 12. Let me get slide 12, which is the Palm Wonderful case. And we'll spend the class going through the remaining slides. I think altogether there are about 19 slides. So we'll go through those 7 slides pretty much tomorrow via Zoom. And then we'll obviously have spring break, and then we'll meet again after spring break with a guest speaker, and then some more discussion of FDA law. And the first draft, I believe, of Project 2 will be due, I think I said what, March 31st, towards the end of the month. So please let me know if there are any questions. I know there's one question about that somebody emailed me, and I'll respond to that to the class later today. So Harven, Dr. de Sheild, so thank you so much again for taking your time, and I'll see everybody tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I actually had I forgot, I actually had a meeting that was coming up.